So today I'm going to talk through the session breakdown of myself, Jeff Slaugh's new single, Odyssey, featuring Daniel Herskedal. Thank you to everyone who's listened so far. It's been awesome to have, I guess, a first solo single for me out and have such a nice reception. I've already seen it being played in over 60 different countries, which is awesome. And I thought I'd do a breakdown of what's going on. So for context, Jeff and I wrote and produced this, and then Daniel Herskedal wrote a huge stack of incredible brass parts down here, which I will look through and talk through. And then I mixed and mastered this track as well as the rest of the album in various locations here in Sydney, on a couple flights across to other places, and in Melbourne. So my trusty Olo S4Xs, as well as going straight into here through my Apollo, was pretty much the entirety of my mixing rig for this, along with a little bit of monitor referencing towards getting to the end of this mix and being back home in my studio. So I like to top level down mix. So I'm going to go through this. I'm going to look at explain what my usual templates are, what I put on the top buses, then explain my grouping methodology, and then I won't break down every single section in super depth, but I will tell you exactly, what made me make certain moves and why I felt like that served the song the best. So to start at a top level, very simple, 2-bus out, instrumental bus. My usual template literally just has these two things with a Slate Digital virtual rack and an FG Grey compressor loaded up onto it. And my usual template also has an a cappella bus, but I deleted that for this, obviously, because there are 0 vocals. In my virtual mix bus, I like to have a little bit of a trimmer, a few EQ boosts, BQs at the high end, give it a little bit more air, and then a little bit of a boost at the 5K, a little bit of a boost at 110. And the truth is that's very adjustable. Like nothing in mixing is a done deal. And then with the FG Grey, this is funny because this isn't parallel compression. Like, I know a lot of people like to parallel compress, and when I'm doing orchestral mixing and mixing for sync, which I've started to get into now, I've found the benefit of having like some parallel compression. But for this one, I had 100% mix, but it was so little compression that I'm pretty sure it only activated it somewhere at like bar 75. If we take a listen, you'll see the little arrow. Yeah, like just there. Yeah, basically that's it. And you might be like, well, why do you even have it on? Because it's picking up something that I can't hear, but it's doing the job that I want it to. It's taking whatever I've set, that threshold to, and it's doing exactly its job. Because there's something somewhere in those stack systems that is doing something ugly, and I want it gone. So if I just A/B with everything on and off, like. I'm listening with headphones, so I can clearly hear a difference. Depending on what you're listening on, if you're listening on your phone, good luck. If you're listening on something else that has like proper speakers, you may have been able to hear like what it is that those plugins achieved. The two plugins I have here what's being routed from the 2 bus out to stereo. I just have Eosis Air. I have a little bit of a low cut, a little bit of dips at like 150, 400, 1.2K, and then a boost at like 800, as well as like a little bit of Sooth deharsher. Sooth's an interesting one because you can use Sooth on a lot of stuff, but it can create a bit of a build up frequency wise that, isn't great. But I have a lot of stems in here that overlap in like same frequency areas. So, a deharsher, just a touch, because they have, Soothe is probably one of the few plugins that I just put on the preset and change nothing. Because the truth is I don't think many people fully understand what Soothe is. It's not an EQ, but it's at the same time, it isn't completely attached to just the frequency either. It addresses a lot of things relating to resonancy as well. So if I put it on and I like how it sounds, I keep it there. If it's creating something that I don't like, I won't put it on. And then at the very top level on stereo, I have a bit of a boost. Yeah, I have a 4K boost. This went into a different mastering session, in which I had a Brainworks compressor. I think I had a Fab's like Saturn 2 by Fab Filter. I have Flatline by Submission Audio, and then I had I want to say something by Isotope, the Exciter, whatever that's actually called. And then at the last two things here, I have like ISOL 8 and Metric AB. Metric AB, I took out all the reference tracks because I didn't want to play them and then YouTube or anything to flag it. But what happens is you can put in other existing songs here and reference like the spectrum wave. So you would switch and it would go to another track. And then ISOL 8, this is a free plugin, by the way. If you don't have this, go get it. Because what you can do is you can specifically just, without having to put a EQ or anything on your session, just very easy. And you can play around with all these different things that you're looking for, and very easily just A/B things without any questions whatsoever. And I think like when I put that on right at the end of what I deem mix like version 1, because I will export this, listen to it, send it to Jeff, or send it to a client, and wait to hear back, make the according adjustments. But something like that is so important. I recommend like doing your first version, stepping away, coming back, putting something like that on, hearing it's like, okay, is every melodic element that I want, can I hear that in the mid-range? Because if I can't hear that in the mid-range, then there's going to be an issue when that translates to other mediums. Not everyone is going to have, a 3 or 5 piece monitor setup. Not everyone's going to have frequency flat headphones. I want everything to be able to pick up. Like, consider where your mix is going. Consider how much room you have to work with. So from there, every mix bus I have has at least 2 plugins that are standard, and that is parallel saturation, where I put like anywhere from 30 to 50% of saturation depending on what it is, and then a limiter. And the limiter is if I feel like I want to, push it. But sometimes it's more just, a little bit of it's more of habit at this point. Then for things like 808s and bass and percussion, I really like the SSL comp. For whatever reason, I just gravitate to that for that sound. Guitar was very straightforward. For stuff like ambiences and swells, I actually am addressing nothing on the individual levels. I feel like it doesn't need it, but I'm grouping them based on their frequency so I can address them all at once. I'm adding EQ, I am adding verb, and I'm adding the parallel saturation, right? And I think this is where it becomes up to mixer discretion, because in this group of 3, I decided that after listening to them as a whole, if I just stretch them out a little bit to find where, see, they're so soft. I have to like blur everything up to actually find where they are. And these are the layers that you don't necessarily know that are there as a listener, but if they weren't there, you would notice. Like, absolutely you. Like, it's not what you're actually listening for. You're listening for your guitar, your pianos, your main core instruments. But if that's removed, there is an absence. But, you listen to them and they actually sound like one sound. So I will treat them as one sound and mix things at a bus level. And then obviously everything here, because there's no vocals, they get sent to the instrumental bus, which gets sent into the 2-bus out, which gets sent into the stereo out. And then they'll print that stereo out and put it in a separate mastering session, which I may or may not break down once the album comes out. Things like percussion, percussion and bass would usually be the most involved. In this session, I know that I kept let me just do that because that's going to kill me if it's a brick wall of sound. For things like bass, depending on what's going on. So like this one has liquid bass and it has 808s. So if I just, we're listening to that. The first thing I can hear there is I've so clearly put a sidechain on with the kick, I'm guessing. Yeah, absolutely, because otherwise it wouldn't sound like that. So usually, and this is where it's mixer discretion about what's going on in a track. Usually I'd probably have a bass bus and then I'd have an 808 bus because I usually have more than one of each. But in this sense, they weren't overlapping areas. I was going to treat them relatively the same. So I do things like EQ, multi-band compression. What did I put on this one? Yeah, like a warmer. Okay. Yeah, so I had a little bit of thickness, a little bit of EQ boost, like the tiniest EQ boost, like basically none on the saturation, like a tiny bit. And on here, like which one did I put? Okay, so you can see that there is like differences between the EQ lines, obviously. I've got the bass low end cut starting a little earlier. I'm just looking at that A being, yeah, and then like a boost on the bass, whereas a dip in the 808, because obviously the 808 is stronger. And then I've got a cut at the 808 because I just didn't need any of this stuff, whereas the bass has information in the higher frequencies that I felt were needed and called for. So I treated them together and then with an SSL comp at the top level. For things like percussion, no matter if it's 1 stem, 50 stems, 5 kicks, 1 kick, they all get bussed out separately. There's a kick bus, there's a hat bus, they all get split up immediately. No questions asked, no negotiations. I am so used to working with like a kick in, a kick out, kick triggers, sampled kicks, plus real kicks all blend together, and your gain stage you're like 5-6 kicks at once, and you're sending that to a kick bus, and like that's a pain, but you get into such a good place where having one kick now becomes infinitely easier, but you also know how to treat kicks better. So I didn't actually do anything on the kick bus this time. I did everything at the overall percussion bus, and then at the individual level, it's the same with the hats bus. But the thing is that I think if anything, drums and percussion in general probably have the most area of potential adjustments. So giving yourself the options to have those areas. Like if I wanted to change something right now, just on the kick, and it wasn't relating to anything that I had already done processing wise, like let's just say I wanted to now put on like an overall room reverb or an overall, I don't know, echo, whatever. I would just apply that to the kick bus and leave this alone and leave the percussion bus alone, because that applies to more than just the kick. So give yourself the most room to work with, I think is always key. You can see an important decision that you have to make with every track that I try and make, I don't know, within the first 10 to 15 moves of a mix is the kick or the bass /808 going to sit above or below? Like, where's the kick sitting? Is it below? Is it not? So if I just make this a little bigger so I can find where it is. Yep, and then I do this too. So they look relatively similar with one distinction. The kick's fundamental note is at 50 hertz. The 808's fundamental note is a lot lower. Sorry, my mistake. The fundamental kick note, you can see, is probably closer to 100 hertz, whereas the fundamental 808 note is probably closer to the 30, 40, 50 hertz. There's a lot of low information there. So I'm making the call to start that cut on the kick at the 50 so that the 808 can breathe a little more without this quadrant of information being as much of a nuisance. It's still there, but if I was to get rid of it, that EQ off, so much more mud. Let me go back to now, put it on. You're creating this low end just power force at the bottom, which is what you want when you're making those decisions of who's sitting where and who's sitting on top, who's sitting underneath. Sometimes the decision's already made for you. Sometimes an 808 or a bass or a kick, their fundamental note is through the roof at 150. Could be some bloody metal kick, and the trigger is at some really high note, and it's decisions made for you, because you're not EQing an 808 way past its fundamental note. So yeah, that's the kind of treatment that I do with low end. With the piano, I addressed this at an individual level because different things needed different stuff. I did some piano, Jeffson did some piano, we had some piano samples in here. All the liquid piano static, piano one, that was Jeff, and then I added a little a melody and some keys as well, and they all require different things. I have track spacer on here, and if you don't know what track spacer is, I recommend it because it's really cool. It's not like a side chain, but what you can see is that I've side chained it. I've done the same thing as a side chain. But I've given it 30% of a side chain, so it's just got space now. It's creating that room. It's creating that space for something to breathe. Side chains are so aggressive, and sometimes you don't want that. You just want a little bit of breathing room for your tracks. And, track space is a great plugin at that. I don't think it's too expensive, but I recommend it. And then I've got, different EQ moves, some more drastic than the others. I really have no idea what went on here. That's the thing. I look back on some of these sessions, I'm just like, what is going on? Because the more and more you mix, the more you pick up. So, you can't just do one EQ, put that on 5 pianos, call it a day. Every single one of these pianos literally looks nothing alike. That's like, the amount of difference in there is actually pretty aggressive too. And whatever decisions I was making at the time mix worked, but maybe I wouldn't have made those again. Maybe I would have. You can see there that I've put on some brick wall stuff here. Clearly I was not a fan of what was ever going on the low end and the high ends. And let's find out why. So I can hear something. And then at the top level, I've just got my normal parallel saturation and limiting. So this is an example of a bus where I did everything at an individual level because I felt like it needed that. It felt like bus treatment wasn't going to cut it. And if I look at this piano, it looks like I literally just did EQ and that's it. If I go back. And I guess I wanted to create that more because I cut out the low ends on that one. So I guess in doing this, now keep in mind, I did this mix like 2-3 months ago. So that's a little context of why I'm saying when I was doing it back then, because when you're working on something every day, you're breaking it down, you're making notes, you're listening to references, you're going for a sound, you come back to it, you don't always know exactly what you were thinking back then, but you can make educated guesses based on the moves and the representation here. So you can see that I cut out the low end. Clearly I was going for more of a layer sound as opposed to something being... See, I think because my best guess was because the brass sits at a low of the low end information, that layer right there is more of a top end layer. And if, you get rid of that, it's very apparent. But without the EQ, there could be some clashing there at the low end, which is why that decision would have been made. Things like guitar, very simple, like a little bit of Valhalla reverb. And here, I put 2 EQs here. I do remember this because this is like something. So another thing, automation, super important. In this track context, there's not a huge amount of automation going on. A lot of the automation going on in this track is quite honestly already printed in to the stems in regards to volume and stuff. There's little things obviously like swells going in, but when people think automation, they immediately think volume, and that's not necessarily true. There can be lots of things, lots of kinds of automations. If I can actually find what I was just looking at, which would be the guitar, right? There's lots of kinds of automations. So don't think that, so if I look at volume set, that's all good. But what's actually going on here is that I distinctly remember this because this is a loop I had that I quite liked, and I changed and I edited and I put, I did what looks like aggressive EQ in conjunction with some reverb, and then a stack of just like mixed bus stuff. Having like the FG bomber is so good. Combined with a little bit of a boost at 10k, a little bit of a duck at the 400, a boost at 60. Um, and then Eosis Air, like the single like EQ, the Earth channel. Um, and then yeah, damage repair on this because I heard the and that's the thing. Things like Splice, things different libraries. You can listen to it and be like, that gives me inspiration. That's gonna fit great in a song, but I have to do X, Y, Z to get it where I need to be. And that's why there's an art in being able to utilize samples, being able to utilize like soundscapes and being able to utilize natural organic sounds that you've made in your studio because you have to edit them to such a high extent. Like if I take this off, and I go back to like this concept of kind of what I aim for with a mix bus is like, this is fitting in a pocket, this is fitting in a sound. And that's the thing, you have to decide what your layers are doing, what is their goal, what's their objective. Like a really good like thing I remember hearing was back in school, they got a bunch of our school leaders to sit down and like they gave us and said, you're stuck in the desert and you have all these objects, what are you going to do? And like we actually started talking about all the different things we were going to do, and then they stopped us and they said, okay, that's great, but what's your actual goal? Because that'll depend on your actions you make. And I remember that because we were sitting in one of the cottages and we all just looked at each other and we're like, oh, right, we actually have to decide on a goal. And that's always front and like foremost in front when I'm making these kinds of decisions, because you could easily have just left that sound alone. It sounds great on its own. But with that off, it's too prominent for where I want it to be. And that is why I make those decisions with EQ. That's why I make decisions with anything, because I have a goal for each sound, and that's where I need it to be. This is interesting. This was literally, I tried RX10, which is like a sound editor. There is a certain frequency that I bloody hate in like this thing. Like I heard it straight away and just couldn't handle it. So you'll see what happens here. Yeah, and that I basically set that all throughout the song. And I wonder if I can like turn that off to like show what happens. There is a tiny, tiny little bit of like, right there's like the tiniest sounds. That's a lot easier to hear soloed and in context, but I basically applied it to every part of that song, like every part of that loop. I applied it across the board. It was in that transition point from the next note. Whoever recorded this part originally left something in that I despised. As a guitarist, it was kind of like the clipping and the pop sound of like a transition. That altogether I didn't hear, but then when like working through with like the ISO 8, like hearing things, I went and did some digging and found it and tried to do RX10 and it didn't work, and then and then eventually I came to the conclusion that I could just knock out the entire frequency that way, and it was it was fine, it was easy. And those are the kind of decisions I make like right at the end when I'm doing like all of my final little stuff and I'm trying to think about what's really going to make this song polish off. I'm listening for mistakes. I'm not listening for the good stuff. Like listening for all the brass, which is the last thing I'm going to talk about now, there was so much so good about this that I was so confident in Daniel's performance of the brass, and the way that it was used. I ended up genuinely using like a lot of his wet stems, to be honest, and then just elevating them, because he printed me dry stems and he printed me wet stems, and to be honest, I used the wet stems and really like just added like little bits to them in conjunction with Shadow Hill's mastering compressor. This thing, if you don't know what the difference between a mastering compressor and a normal compressor is, go do some reading on it. It's basically the fact that a mastering compressor can get it down to like the mill, like the when you have a normal compressor and you dial it to like, you know, 0.2, it's not 0.2, it's somewhere between 0.4 and 0.3, in that range. When you dial a mastering compressor to 0.2, it's to 0.2. It's created in a way that it is exactly what you want, you know, and that's why they're more expensive. That's why they have all these dials. You know, this one's especially aggressive. But if I just... it just brings that power to it. His performance was incredible. I loved them. You can see that I even like boosted some of it because I just wanted like them louder in context with what the rest of the mix was going on. I definitely did do like a bit of notching. You know, this is probably not... I wouldn't recommend doing this much notching this aggressively so much, and certainly don't do it solo. That's interesting. Do I just have an EQ that I just never used? This is the final session, by the way, so if I just printed that and just went with it, it literally means that I did nothing to it. And other than some reverb, I guess, you know. Yeah. Everyone has different approaches, and I'm sure in 5 years' time, I'll look back on this session and be like, oh, why did I do that? But the truth is that you learn and grow as a mix engineer like you do as a musician. And if anything, being a mix engineer, you can take the same song and do it 20 times over if you do it at 20 different points in your life. And it can all be the same performance and everything, but you'll make it sound exactly, like, in no way the same. It'll be different. So EQ, Valhalla reverb going into like, you know, a mastering compressor, something a little bit more full on. I didn't have any compression as hardcore as this across the song. Maybe across the kicks and the bass with the SSL compressor was a little more full on. But yeah, the performances, and I think this goes for anything without saying, the performances are really key to making sure your mix is going to sound great. You cannot mix repair performances that are beyond audible. Like, you can do a lot. I've completely replaced drums before with sample drums and made it sound amazing, like compared to their original performance. But if you have real drums performed perfectly from the get-go, and you can just elevate them and add some layering underneath them, that's so much better and so much easier time-wise than trying to repair a performance. Daniel's performance is an example of something that's just great. And the other feature that we had on the album, which, you know, you'll see, his performances in a vocal context were amazing as well. And when you work with quality musicians, you get quality results. And this is an example of really not having to do that much beyond like what I wanted it to do in context. Because out of context, if I take all this stuff off, you know, that performance is really moving and incredible in its own right. But I've just added things because I want it to sit in a certain way with the track. and it needs that little push. So that is the mix and session breakdown of Odyssey. If you haven't streamed it, I'll put all the links in the bio. You can pre-order the album on Bandcamp and just stream it. Any form of support, it's awesome. Jeff and I are really excited to put this out. But no, thank you for watching the breakdown, and I hope for all the mix engineers out there is educational, and for all the non-musicians out there is insightful into what goes into a final track. But yeah, thanks for watching.